There are three great dramatists of ancient Greece, and they all lived at the same time. The eldest was Aeschylus, who wrote Agamemnon, Oresteia, and Prometheus Bound. The youngest was Euripides, best known for the Trojan women and Medea. And the middle of the three was the greatest of all, Sophocles, the master of Greek tragedy. The life and career of Sophocles spanned the period of greatest political and cultural achievement in Athens. During the 5th century before Christ, when he lived, there was a sudden explosion of intellectual, philosophical, and artistic invention. Everything seemed to be expanding. No goal seemed impossible, and the faith and confidence of humankind reached a pinnacle. This sense of faith in the potential of humanity was expressed perfectly by Sophocles himself in a line from Antigone which reads, "Many a mighty creature lives, but none mightier than man." Such vitality and confidence didn't occur again until 1800 years later during the Renaissance. During these golden days of Greece, Athens was its most magnificent city, the meeting place of artists and thinkers, and a center of shipping and trade. Sophocles was born outside of Athens in 496 BC in a village named Colonus. His father, Sophocles, was a wealthy manufacturer of armor who made sure his son received an excellent education. He may have studied drama under Aeschylus, and he learned music from Lampros, the most famous musician of the time. Music to Athenians was more than a source of entertainment. It was considered an influence towards good behavior. Sophocles, like all boys, probably also learned by heart many passages of the old poets, and from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. As a teenager, Sophocles seemed to have been the very embodiment of Greek ideals. He was handsome, had a beautiful physique, and excelled at both athletics and music. Because of his fine qualities, he was chosen at age 16 to lead the Paean, a choral chant to the gods, which celebrated the Greek victory over the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. It was a battle he had witnessed as a young trainee in the army. When he came of age at 18, Sophocles would have had to have taken the oath of citizenship, composed by Solon, the Athenian legislator who lived 200 years earlier and became famous for his social and political reforms. The oath called upon every youth to never disgrace his sacred arms, never to forsake his comrade in the ranks, but to fight for the sacred temples and the common welfare, whether alone or with others, to leave his country not in a worse but in a better state than he found it, to obey the magistrates and the laws and to defend them against attack, finally to hold in honor the religion of his country. It would seem Sophocles fully lived up to this oath his entire life. There is no doubt he left his country not in a worse but a better state, for he advanced its literature so profoundly that it has been read, produced, and admired ever since. Although there isn't a lot of information about his life, there's enough to know Sophocles was a popular citizen, an outstanding artist, and a man who took an active interest in the politics and religion of his state. As an adult, his friends included some of the most renowned people in Athens, including Pericles, leading statesman of the city, and Herodotus, the greatest ancient historian. Like most Greeks, he was civic-minded. Sophocles played some role in public life for almost the entire 90 years he lived. He was a city treasurer when he was 53, in charge of regulating the tributes or taxes from subjects of Athens. Around the same time, he served with Pericles as a general during the Samian Revolt, and possibly later during the Peloponnesian War. According to legend, he won that appointment as general because of the success of his play Antigone the previous year. Even when he was in his 80s, he was serving the state as one of the 10 commissioners who governed Athens after the disastrous Sicilian expedition. His task then was to help with the financial and domestic recovery of Athens after its defeat. The last public act we know of occurred when Sophocles was 90 and led a chorus in public mourning for the younger playwright Euripides. He himself died shortly after. Sophocles was a highly respected figure in Greece. Besides his plays and his services as a general and a politician, he was also a priest. As a man, he was noted for his grace, his geniality, and his brilliance. One writer of the time said, "He had such charm of character that he was loved by everybody wherever he went." He was on easy terms with all the leading families and prominent statesmen of Athens, yet doesn't seem to have suffered any arrogance. Sophocles wrote about 123 dramas in all, and from the age of about 28 on, he won many dramatic awards, including 24 victories in the annual playwriting contest held in Athens. Since he entered the competition only 30 times altogether, this was an outstanding success. His first award was especially important because he defeated the already famous and admired Aeschylus, who was over 50 years his senior, and did it with his very first play. In the end, Aeschylus won the competition 13 times, and Euripides won it 4 times, compared to Sophocles' total of 24. The Greeks had grown weary of the grandiose language of Aeschylus, and they were nervous about Euripides, who was a skeptic and raised questions about their beliefs in the gods. Sophocles, on the other hand, was deeply religious and upheld the old-fashioned beliefs and values the Athenians held so dear. When Sophocles was 89 years old, he ran into a little trouble with his son, who feared Sophocles was intending to cut him out of his will. The son brought him before a court of law, where he tried to have him certified as suffering from senility. Sophocles commented to the court, "If I am Sophocles, I am not out of my mind. If I am out of my mind, then I am not Sophocles." Then he proceeded to read passages from his most recent work, Oedipus at Colonus, which he'd completed, but which hadn't yet been staged. When he was finished, the judge dismissed the case and fined Sophocles' son. To the Athenians, artistic achievement spoke for itself. Sophocles died in 406 B.C., just 2 years before the final surrender of Athens to Sparta. It seems fortunate he missed it, for he was clearly devoted to the city, and in his last play had affectionately praised both his own birthplace, Colonus, and Athens itself. He passed away just as the great age of Greece was itself expiring. Seldom in history was there a people who admired and loved drama as much as the ancient Greeks. They made such an essential contribution to theater that many of their words are still part of our dramatic vocabulary. The word scene comes from skene, which was a tent made of animal skins to which the actors retired after performing. The words tragedy and comedy both are derived from Greek, and chorus came from chros, the group which danced and sang in the early plays. In fact, the very word drama itself comes from the Greek word for deed or action. The Greeks put great care into the building of their beautiful theaters, which were always centrally located and could seat thousands of devoted fans from every class of society. All of Athens seemed to live outdoors, socializing in the streets, exercising in the athletic grounds, celebrating the Olympic Games, and gathering at its favorite center of activities, the open-air marketplace, around which many of its most important buildings were built. A Greek theater, too, was always open to the sky, and usually built on a hill, so the slope could be used for rows of stone seats that all offered a good view. This meant Athenians no longer had to build them on elevated timbers or scaffolds as they had once done in a temporary theater in the marketplace. They had learned from this mistake, though scaffolds had collapsed, injuring and killing many of the spectators. In Athens, the theater was built on the slope at the foot of the Acropolis, in the shadow of the Parthenon, the ruins of which still stand today. The outdoor auditorium was shaped in a semicircle, and at either side was a passageway through which the theater committee or the actors made their entrance. These passageways led directly to a circular orchestra section made of hard-packed earth and surrounded by a stone gutter to catch rainwater which tumbled down from the seating section. There was really no orchestra that performed here. It was a circular area that originally had been the site of performances before the Greeks conceived of the stage. The wooden seats of the audience were divided into wedge-shaped sections flanked by stone steps, and if the theater was large, there also might have been a level aisle partway up the slope. Into these seats would parade as many as 17,000 Athenians, anxious to see the new work by their favorite playwright. Almost all citizens wore the simple white garments that we still associate today with the image of classic Greece. The garments were plain and unpretentious, but still, refined Athenians took much pride in how expertly they could drape their costumes and the gracefulness and sweeping lines with which they could arrange the folds of the cloth. A statue of Sophocles from about this time shows him standing in a thoughtful pose, his white robe draped elegantly about his shoulders, the fabric holding one arm like a sling and dropping from the other arm like a short train. He has very short wavy hair, a full curly beard, and an expression almost as tragic as his plays. The front row of seats in the theater, which faced the orchestra, was reserved for dignitaries and persons of greatest importance. These seats were made of marble and often supplied with backs for support. Some were even constructed like miniature thrones and were slightly set apart from the rest. From every seat in the theater, Athenians had a grand panoramic view of the sea, its islands, and even the heights of Argolis, 40 miles in the distance. The stage in a Greek theater was never connected to the rest of the theater. That happened later in Roman times. It was a separate construction behind the orchestra section, and it was made of 2 levels. On the lower level was a series of columns, and between the columns were painted screens, which could swivel around and show additional scenes on the back. These scenes were neither realistic or natural. They were ornamental paintings, often of elaborate Greek architecture. Above the scenes on the second level was a narrow platform, also enclosed by columns, which is where most of the action of the play occurred. It was in this setting, over 2,000 years ago, that the drama was born. It had taken many years for the Greek drama to develop. At first there had only been ancient feasts of singing, dancing, and storytelling. But by the time of Sophocles, this general revelry had evolved into authentic plays with sophisticated scripts and trained actors. It was Sophocles who would bring the art to its culmination, with his mastery of stagecraft and plot, and his striking, complex characters. It was a thrill for an audience to see a play by Sophocles, and it was an honor for an actor to have a role in one. Actors made their way to the stage of the theater by stairs or ramps at the back of the building. Some theaters also had a trap door at the top of the platform, from which the gods could make their appearance. The narrative in the plays was largely carried on in song by the chorus, but it was broken up too by the dialogue of the characters, an effect not unlike today's opera. The scripts were as much poetry as prose. Women never appeared on the stage in Greek theater. Instead, young men or boys played their parts. All the actors usually wore masks that were specially designed for the story. So devoted to their city were the citizens of Athens that they made surprisingly large contributions to its civic projects. The choruses at the theater productions were organized and financed by private citizens, who paid large sums for their training and costumes. One citizen on record donated over $14,000 in support of the choruses over a period of 9 years, a considerable fortune in those days. The citizens were competitive about the choruses they financed, each hoping theirs would outshine the others. The most festive day of the year at the theater was the Feast of Dionysus, held every spring. Dionysus was the god of wine and was associated with the release of mass emotion or with mass ecstasy. A temple built in his honor stood just to the left of the theater. For this yearly feast, the greatest playwrights each submitted 4 dramas, 3 tragedies and 1 comedy, to be played in the theater and judged by a jury of critics. As many as 2,000 men and boys would have spent all their leisure time for a year learning their parts, which were written out on sheets of papyrus, and training and rehearsing for the different choruses. All of Athens streamed to the theater to see these plays and to select and argue about their favorites. For the great dramatic competition of the feast day, the state paid the admission tickets for all citizens who wanted to attend. To the Greeks, the theater and all that happened there belonged to the people. They were generally intelligent and well-mannered, but some of them weren't above catcalls or pelting the actors with food if the play didn't please them. During feast days, the great tragedies were shown in the morning, and in the afternoon comedies were offered. No one, no matter how important or powerful, was protected from parody or absurd caricature in the Greek comedies. The city's leader Pericles, the great philosopher Socrates, even the writer Euripides himself were made fun of at some time or another while the audience roared with laughter. There were also merciless satires of other politicians, merchants, generals, slaves, and any other group or individual that caught the writer's fancy. Parodies on great passages of literature were also a hit, since the average Athenian was extremely well-read and informed. For those who weren't, the theater was the Athenian version of adult education. When the plays were over, everyone waited anxiously to hear which tragedies and comedies had been awarded the prize, and which citizen had received a bronze tripod for equipping and training the best chorus. It was this annual prize in playwriting, at the Feast of Dionysus, that Sophocles won 24 out of the 30 times he entered. 7 out of Sophocles' plays have survived complete. There are about 1,000 fragments of other plays. The surviving plays of Sophocles include Ajax, Antigone, Oedipus Rex, also known as Oedipus Tyrannus, Electra, Trachiniae, Philoctetes, and Oedipus at Colonus. Of those 7, Oedipus Rex, which means Oedipus the King, is considered his masterpiece and the ultimate example of Greek dramatic irony, when an actor doesn't realize the significance of what he says, but the audience does. Sophocles was a master at dialogue, plot construction, and characterization. He was also one of theater's greatest innovators. He introduced many new ideas to drama that broke precedent with the past. At a time when most Greek plays had only 2 characters, he added a third, so he could explore a wider range of human interactions. He also increased the size of the chorus from 12 to 15 for dramatic effect, and was praised by Aristotle for his skill in integrating the chorus into the action of the play. In addition, Sophocles introduced scene painting, or some kind of background pictures, to help build atmosphere and establish locale. He also abandoned the popular trilogy form, 3 plays to tell one story, in favor of the one self-contained play. His characters, too, broke from tradition. Unlike most Greek characters, the fates of Sophocles are determined more by their own faults than by the whims of the gods. Because of this idea of individual responsibility, his work profoundly influenced Western tragedy. It was Sophocles, too, who developed the idea of focusing on a single powerful hero, a model of tragedy that Western literature has followed ever since. All his heroes and heroines are people of strong passions who never waver in their commitment to their ideals, and who judge themselves and others harshly. They have destinies which are somehow tied up in divine will or fate, but in spite of that, they have to work out their lives in their own ways. The challenge for the heroes in Sophocles' plays is to discover and acknowledge that destiny while at the same time remaining true to their own noble nature. It's the struggle of a strong individual against fate, in which the hero is forced to choose a course of action that makes him or her nobler or somehow benefits others. Usually the course the hero chooses is one the chorus and the minor characters disagree with, and so he must go it alone. The difficult decision the hero makes as he struggles to do what is right usually means there is much intrigue and suspense, a lot of suffering, and oftentimes the death of the hero. He makes mistakes, either basing his decisions on rumors or false reports, making hasty judgments or being falsely optimistic, and his mistakes lead to his ruin, and often the ruin of others. The gods in Sophocles' play represent the natural, mysterious forces of the universe which affect human beings whether they realize it or not. To Sophocles, humans live mostly in dark ignorance because they're cut off from these mysterious forces of reality. Only through pain, suffering, and loss do they come to see and understand them. Where Euripides, the great contemporary of Sophocles, created ordinary characters, Sophocles created characters that were larger than life. Aristotle said Euripides portrayed people as they are, Sophocles portrayed people as they should be. The gods Sophocles created are typical of Greek drama in some ways and not in others. They are remote, difficult to figure out, and their justice is unpredictable and sometimes cruel. That's traditional of Greek thought, but unlike the gods portrayed by other playwrights, those in Sophocles' works seldom intervene in the action, except indirectly through oracles and omens. They symbolize the ultimate and unyielding realities that humanity struggles to understand. The work of Sophocles can be divided into three periods. The earliest works, which include Ajax, were influenced by the older playwright Aeschylus. The second period, in which he wrote Antigone, has a style that's a little more harsh and somewhat contrived. It's his third period in which he reached creative maturity and developed the method he said was most suited to depicting character. This is the period that produced the classic work, Oedipus Rex. All of the stories Sophocles wrote about were well known to his audience. He drew on ancient myths that Greeks had known by heart from childhood, and which embodied their highest ideals and their deepest questions about life. For that reason, there's seldom any unnecessary background or explanation in his plays. The earliest play we have by him, written probably when he was in his 30s, is Ajax, a story about the nobility and also the rigidity of the old heroic ideals of Greece. Ajax is a mighty hero of the Trojan War, whose pride drives him to treachery and finally to his own ruin and suicide. He starts out deeply offended when an award of valor is given not to him, but to Odysseus. He's so incensed by this that he tries to assassinate both Odysseus and all the contest judges, plus the commanders of the Greek forces. When his attempts are blocked by the goddess Athena, he throws himself on his own sword in humiliation. The Greek commanders order that his body be left unburied as punishment, but Odysseus intervenes and arranges an honorable burial. One of Sophocles' great contributions to literature was his creation of notable female characters, especially Antigone and Electra. He created a wide variety of multi-dimensional women characters who ranged from noble and heroic to deceitful, frightening, and perhaps even mad. Sophocles granted his heroines roles of influence unlike any they would have actually had in Athens and Greece. Antigone, which he wrote in his mid-50s, is about the heroine's devotion to her dead brother and pits her emotional and religious values against the detached, rational, and non-religious views of the king of Thebes. In some ways, she chose between her love of God and the love of her country. On a more political level, it's sometimes seen as a story about the clash between the state and the individual. Antigone's brother Polynices has been killed in an attack on Thebes. Creon, the king of Thebes, and uncle to Polynices and Antigone, has forbidden his nephew's corpse to be buried as punishment for his betrayal. But out of devotion and love for her brother, Antigone buries him anyway, and is sentenced to death for her crime. Creon refuses to commute the sentence at first, but eventually is persuaded to do so by a prophet. By the time he changes his mind, however, it's too late. Antigone has killed herself in her prison cell. The Creon's son kills himself out of his love for Antigone, and finally Creon's wife kills herself over grief for her son. At the end, Creon is left alone and desolate. He has fulfilled his civic duties at cost to his sense of humanity and to his own happiness. The masterpiece of Sophocles, and one of the most influential plays ever written, is Oedipus Rex, which he wrote in his late 60s, around 429 BC. The power of Oedipus Rex lies in the way character and destiny play off each other and the paradoxes of human knowledge and ignorance. Aristotle, who thought the construction of the play was almost perfect, used it as his model tragic plot. And Sigmund Freud used it 2,000 years later as his model for the Oedipus complex, one of the central features in psychoanalysis. The Oedipus complex is a strong attachment for a son to his mother, which to Freud included repressed sexual attraction and jealousy of the father. The play's hero, Oedipus, is the happy and beloved ruler of Thebes, who, although impatient and hot-tempered, seems generally to govern with wisdom. His problem is that he mistakenly believes himself to be the son of the king and queen of Corinth, who raised him. He had left Corinth forever because of a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus became the ruler of Thebes when he saved the city by correctly answering the riddle of the Sphinx. As part of his reward, he was given Jocasta, the widowed queen of Thebes, as his wife. When a plague hits Thebes, Oedipus is told by the oracle that it will end only when he finds the murderer of Jocasta's husband, who is still unknown. Through much of the rest of the play, Oedipus searches for the murderer, only to uncover his own hidden past and discover that an old man he once killed on the road was Jocasta's husband, and that the two were his parents and had abandoned him at birth when he was adopted by the king of Corinth, and that he is indeed married to his own mother and has children who are his siblings. When Jocasta finds out about this, she kills herself, and the guilt-stricken Oedipus then sticks needles into his eyes, blinding himself. At the end, he is sightless and alone, but finally aware of the truth of his own life. Sophocles felt that suffering was ultimately beneficial for two reasons. It gives humans the opportunity to show their dignity and heroism, and it teaches them to understand the meaning of life. In his last decade, when he was in his 70s, Sophocles wrote Electra, a play about justice and vengeance, not to be confused with a play of the same name written by Euripides around the same time. Electra and her brother plot to kill their mother and their mother's lover, who had murdered their father. In the end, they succeed, although whether this is a triumph of virtue or a triumph of insanity depends on the interpretation. Sophocles' very last works, Philoctetes and Oedipus at Colonus, deal with embittered heroes in exile who are eventually reconciled with society and the gods. Sophocles completed Oedipus at Colonus, the sequel to Oedipus Rex, when he was almost 90 years old, and it wasn't produced until after his death by his grandson. In this last play, Oedipus is old and blind and has spent many years wandering in exile after being rejected by his sons and by the city of Thebes. Only his daughters Antigone and Ismene have remained loyal, the same Antigone in the play of that name. Eventually, he arrives at the sacred grove in Colonus, the village where Sophocles himself was born. In Colonus, Oedipus is given the protection of the king of Athens. He rejects the entreaties of his son Polynices, who is determined to attack Thebes. At the end of the story, Oedipus experiences a mysterious death in which he's apparently swallowed up by the earth, where he's to become a benevolent power that will defend the city of Colonus, which gave him his last refuge. The play is known for its lyrical beauty, its air of melancholy, and the rise of Oedipus to a spiritual figure. The great dramatic achievement of Sophocles was that he took ancient myths and found a new format for them, one with stronger characters who are more fully developed and with more symbolism and significance beneath the surface details of the plot. Because of his technical innovations, drama moved forward along more realistic lines that gave it lasting and universal appeal. 100 years later, when the Greeks were suffering a famine and appealed to the king of Egypt for help, he agreed to send them food on the condition that they sent him copies of Sophocles' plays for his great library in Alexandria. 2,200 years later, when the great English poet Shelley drowned, a volume of Sophocles was found in his pocket. And today, the plays of Sophocles are still produced and still have a powerful effect on modern audiences. He wrote of conflicts and sufferings that can be understood and interpreted in our own troubled times as they can in any time. Sophocles lived at a time and in a place where the thirst for knowledge was unquenchable. It began a few hundred years before him and continued for hundreds of years after him. As an example, St. Paul was abused, beaten, and imprisoned all through Asia Minor as he tried to spread the word of Christ. But when he arrived in Athens, they took him before the council and said, "Tell us about these new teachings." That commitment to learning and understanding their world that marked early Greek civilization was reflected in Sophocles' plays, where both the characters and the audience struggle to understand which values and morals are the highest, whether humanity is controlled by external forces or makes its own choices, and what the ultimate purpose of life might be. It was not until Shakespeare appeared 1900 years later that drama once again held such power and explored such basic and profound human dilemmas.
This is the end of the session.